Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Therapy on Tap. This is episode 4. And for today's episode, I want to talk about feelings, emotions, and a big problem that's been, I think, pretty pervasive throughout the mental health community recently. This idea that all feelings are valid. All of our feelings are valid. And I want to talk about this idea and whether or not this is true and why I think this has become such a hot topic for people. It makes sense to me why people want to feel like their feelings are valid, right? I mean, people want to feel heard, and a lot of people are often not heard, and they're not heard in many different aspects in their life, in their relationships, in their family, in their friends, at work, and people want to feel like the things that are happening to them and the things they're experiencing are real. No one wants to feel like they're just making it up or they're crazy or anything like that. So it makes total sense to me. And I think depending on what you mean by valid, I think it could be fair to say that all feelings are valid, right? But it depends on what you mean by valid. If by valid you mean that they exist, then yes, all feelings are valid. I don't think anyone can tell you that you're not having a feeling that you're clearly having. So there's no doubt that every feeling you're having, right, assuming you're not lying about it, but why would you lie about it? Assuming you're not lying about it, any feeling you have, if you feel it, it's real. That is really happening to you. You don't have to explain that to anybody. That should just be assumed that if you tell someone this is how I'm feeling, that's how you're feeling. And that is true in the sense that you're experiencing it. But I think sometimes when people use this phrase, my feelings are valid, what they mean is my feelings are justified. And I think in this case, we have to be careful about what we mean by justified. Because a lot of times we can have a feeling about something that might not be in alignment with what is actually going on. And if we react instinctively to that feeling without checking it or challenging it or making sure we have all the facts, we run the risk of really hurting our relationships and affecting how we treat people. And I would argue even affecting how we treat ourselves. I think it's good for yourself to admit that sometimes your feelings may not be valid. And I think here's a perfect example of this. How about the feeling guilt, right? We all feel guilt. Okay, well, not all of us, unfortunately. Some people don't. Most of us feel guilt. And sometimes we feel guilt for reasons that we shouldn't, right? Sometimes we feel guilty about something that we had nothing to do with, we had no part in, and yet we still feel guilty. So is that emotion valid? Well, again, it's valid in the sense that you feel it, and it's true in the sense that it exists, but it's not valid because it's not justifiable, right? If somebody hurts you, but somehow you feel guilty, you shouldn't feel guilty, right? And that's something you have to work within yourself so that you're not always feeling guilty all the time, right? You see this with people who apologize for every little thing that they do. Right? Every little minor inconvenience that they create for someone else, they apologize because they feel guilty. But just because you feel guilty doesn't mean you have to apologize, right? So it can affect your relationship with yourself. And obviously it can affect your relationship with other people. If you feel angry a lot of the time with other people and you don't really have a justifiable reason to be angry, well, you're going to damage a lot of relationships because people are going to get sick and tired of feeling blamed for your anger, right? Now, there's a way to have anger and not take it out on others and take it in, don't externalize it, and acknowledge the fact that you're feeling how you're feeling. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? But when we start accusing people of doing something, maybe we accuse an intent in someone, right? We accuse that someone intended to hurt us when they really didn't. Or we misconstrue the facts. We think something happened that didn't actually happen. Perfect example would be you accuse your partner of cheating, even though there's no evidence of cheating. And in fact, they did not cheat. That's sort of like a classic example. This happens all the time. So you have to be careful that when you have a feeling, you have to investigate it. You have to be careful to not let that feeling just run rampant because it will damage your relationships and it can damage yourself. So this isn't about invalidating yourself. And in fact, I do think it's also important to realize that I'm not saying that people should be invalidating your feelings just because they're wrong. People should still hear you out. People should always hear you out, okay? And a great way to do this is you express a feeling and the other person should be able to repeat back to you what your feeling is and explain it, even if it doesn't make total sense to them. But I think we can all admit that sometimes we're all irrational, right? So we have to realize that we're all irrational sometimes. So if you're talking to your partner and they say something that doesn't make sense and it's confusing, don't just judge it. Don't ignore it. Don't try to push it away. You should listen to how they feel. I'm not saying that we shouldn't validate each other's experience, especially if you care about someone, you have to, right? Because we're all going to have feelings that pop up that don't always make sense And sometimes we have to dig deeper to make sense of that feeling. I'm not saying that just because not all emotions are justifiable, that means that people should just not listen to you or not try to hear what you're trying to say, because that is very important. And it really is the only way to connect, is people want to feel emotionally understood. Okay, so how do we work on this? How do we improve this? How do we get ourselves more in alignment with what's really going on and make sure that our emotions don't overpower us and damage our relationships? Well, the first thing I think is just acknowledging the fact that, look, not all your emotions are always going to make sense to other people. And sometimes they're not even going to make sense to yourself. And just because you feel something doesn't mean it's true. And this is, again, not just good for other people. This is good for you, because a lot of times we have feelings like shame and guilt. These are very negative feelings about ourselves. But again, just because we feel them doesn't mean that it's true. It doesn't mean that we deserve to feel shame or we deserve to feel guilt. Okay. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we should feel guilty because we've done something wrong. But a lot of times that's not the case. Sometimes we feel guilty for reasons that have nothing to do with us. It could be something about our past, right? Like maybe we grew up in a household where we were blamed for a lot of things, so we're quick to feel guilty about things. So we have to challenge that to better ourselves, really. So the first thing you have to do is check the facts. Okay, so if you want to get your emotions in alignment, you have to check the facts on a situation. When something comes in, you have to realize that whatever your interpretation of it is, that's just your interpretation. It's just your perspective. It doesn't make it wrong. It just means it's biased. We all have our own biases from our past, from our worldview. And so when we get information fed into us, it is being filtered through our brain. Not everything that comes to us, I would say nothing that comes to us is completely objective. Everything is tainted by our past, our worldview. So we have to realize when we have a reaction or we have assumptions about something, that's coming from us. So we have to look at the facts. So if we're making assumptions about someone's intent or what they did to us or what we think they did to us, again, we have to realize that that's just our interpretation. Now, sometimes it is the case that you're right? And someone is really manipulating you or treating you poorly. And if there's a pattern of this, then you have to be mindful of that so you can create some distance with that person. But we still need to check our facts. We need to check what's really going on before we make assumptions about what other people are doing to us or what feelings we're having about ourselves. Okay, so the next thing you have to do is you have to identify the feeling. What is the feeling? Is it anger? Is it frustration? Is it sadness? A lot of times, for example, anger is a secondary emotion. We might feel sad about something. We might feel insecure about something. Something that happens in our relationship makes us feel insecure. Something makes us feel unworthy or something like that. We don't like that feeling. That's an uncomfortable feeling. So instead, we replace it with anger, and then we lash out at the other person. So we have to realize, what is the underlying emotion? What is it telling us about ourselves? What does it mean to us? Where does it come from? Again, did we have a history of being treated poorly? Did we have a history of relationships where our trust was broken? And so now we're very quick to assume that others are going to break our trust. We have to constantly keep this in check and make sure we're not just reacting purely on emotion. And the final thing you have to do, again, is changing the assumption. So you have to notice, what kind of assumptions am I making? Am I assuming that everybody's out to get me? Because if that's the case, then every time input comes in, it's going to filter through your brain that that person is out to get you. So everything that they do is clouded in your assumptions about them, about the world. So you have to come to grips with the fact that sometimes we do have biases and we do have histories and we have things that make us think not always so clearly. We don't always see things the way they are. And again, that's true about ourselves too. Right? We're all made to feel guilty at times in our life, or maybe someone really digs it in. And if that happens long enough, you're just going to feel guilty about everything. So you have to realize that everything is being filtered through your history, through your past, through your mind. Not everything is objective. And you have to create some distance from your emotion so you can make sense of it. And then you can come back to the emotion. If you have really intense emotions, you may have to learn how to regulate the actual emotion itself. Could be anger, could be sadness, could be anxiety. Whatever the feeling is, sometimes we have it really intensely. We can't really think logically. This is why people get upset when they're trying to express an emotion and someone tries to be logical with them, because they're not thinking logically. They're thinking with their emotional brain. There's nothing wrong with that. We're all irrational sometimes. We all have an emotional side to us. So when someone's speaking emotionally and we respond logically, it doesn't compute. We have to respond emotion to emotion and then logic to logic. You have to do the same thing with yourself. So if you're really, really escalated, you're not going to be able to do these sort of challenging exercises where you challenge your assumptions, you try to look at things in a different way, you try to take different perspectives. This is going to be really hard if you're in an emotional state. So you have to learn how to regulate your emotions. You can do this by breathing exercises. You can do this by sitting with the emotion and let it ride it out. There's this concept in dialectical behavioral therapy, which is used for oftentimes people with borderline personality disorder, but can be used for anyone really. There's this idea of radical acceptance, right? Which means that when the emotion comes, you accept it, you embrace the emotion. You don't try to fight it, you don't try to push it away. You get comfortable with the discomfort. You learn to regulate the emotion by learning to experience the emotion in its fullest depth. You don't try to push it away, and you don't try to do anything to make yourself avoid the emotion or escape the emotion. And then you also have to realize again that emotions are just emotions. They don't actually tell us anything about who we are. So if we feel really guilty, that doesn't make us a bad person. You really have to work on separating the concept, the idea of a bad person from the feeling of a bad person, for example, or the idea that you're being betrayed from the feeling of feeling betrayed. That's very different. Feeling betrayed and being betrayed are very different. Sometimes people are not always out to get us. And again, if we assume that they are, we're going to damage our relationships. So I know this is a hot button topic and not everybody's going to agree with this, and that's okay. So again, I'm not saying that emotions are not valid. Okay, they are valid in the sense they are true. I'm also not saying that we shouldn't validate other emotions, other people's emotions. If someone's coming to us and they're trusting us with something that's really painful, because a lot of times, again, people know that their emotions don't make sense. So if they're being vulnerable enough to show it to you, you have to listen to them. You have to try to understand their emotion, even if it doesn't make sense. Empathy is literally putting yourself in someone else's shoes, feeling what they feel, seeing their perspective from their perspective. So if you're the partner on the other end, you have to be able to do that, to really understand where someone's coming from. Then you can make sense of it later. But don't try to hit their emotion with your logic. It's not going to work yet. You have to slow it down, let the emotion come first, work together to regulate the emotion. And then later you can discuss it in a level head. And sometimes if the emotion is too intense, you may not be able to talk about it at all yet. You may have to go in separate rooms and relax for a bit until you both calm down. And then you can come and talk about it in a more rational way. But just because emotions are not always justifiable doesn't mean that we shouldn't listen to people's emotions, because all of us have unjustifiable emotions sometimes. This happens to everybody. Right. So we have to acknowledge that and be humble about that fact. Okay. So I know this idea might be hard for some of you to hear, but I think there's some truth to this. And I think that it actually would be beneficial, again, not only to your relationships, but to yourself, because you'll start to realize that just because you have a negative feeling about yourself doesn't make it true. There are other ways to look at things, and we have to start to build a gap between our emotions and our beliefs about ourselves. Those are two very different things. Thanks again for listening in, and I'll see you soon.